Thank you for attending today's panel on Lifecycle DRM. My name is Christopher Levy. I'm going to be your host today. I wanted to first off thank ITI and Streaming Media for having us here today. I know it's a big room, but there's going to be a lot of great knowledge imparted here, so thank you for attending. My background is in streaming media. I was one of the people that helped pioneer the business in 1994 in Austin, Texas. My first client was Mark Cuban, and I started producing webcasts around the world. And at some point, I got into the DRM security business because I realized the value of streaming media at large, and most of our major clients weren't really deriving analytics or information about the people that they were interacting with on the web, and they also didn't have the ability to control the use of their content. So I've been in the DRM business for about 14 years. I'm going on my 15th year. And this is my 21st Streaming Media West show. So I've seen this show grow from the basement of the Hyatt in San Francisco to today. So I'm really happy to be here. I'd like to go ahead and introduce my fellow panelists. Quick disclaimer, these are customers of my company, but today's panel is about a very generic, vendor-agnostic discussion around how you can use DRM to close the gaps in the life cycle of your video distribution, from creation to consumer. Now, today we have on the panel three different gentlemen who represent what I consider to be three emerging markets for DRM, and really the primary markets where DRM is in play right now. So to my left, I have Steve Cronan. Steve is the CEO and founder of Fifth Kind. Steve, tell us a little bit about yourself and Fifth Kind.
So we provide digital asset management, workflow management systems. Was born out of basically on the Matrix sequels. So I had a background in software engineering, worked on those two films, saw the amount of fragmentation they had between all their different systems. And so I went on a journey of how to unify the studio, the production, the department into one central secure platform and managing all the different types of content.
Thank you. And we're going to talk a little bit about how Steve's firm, with their digital asset management platform, uses DRM as part of that for protecting high-value media. Next up, I've got Gulliver Smithers here from Sony. I would say Sony Crackle, but I think it's Crackle Plus now. And Gulliver and I have been working together for quite some time over the evolution of the different Sony brands, and we work together on some other platforms. But Gulliver, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, yeah, so I head up the product and technology for a couple of things for Sony, actually. So Crackle is one of our products, Funimation is another, and we also have the Sony Pictures TV networks. So we run a end-to-end OTT platform that deals with everything right down to the apps and the design of the apps, right from supply chain, et cetera. So I'm based in LA at a team here.
Yes. And if you're not familiar with Sony Crackle or the AVOD market, I would say that Sony Crackle and Tubi TV and Pluto TV are probably the big three in the AVOD marketplace. So we're going to talk about B2B use of DRM with Gulliver. And last, this gentleman on the end, Corey Smith. Corey, I've known Corey since the days of Microsoft Studios, and he worked for another company that's in the room. But Corey just finished wrangling what I consider to be one of the premier live pay-per-view events on the web. Blizzard hosts their annual Blizzcon event, and we've worked with Corey on this, but Corey has solved a lot of to-scale problems around streaming live esports on the internet, and they use DRM. But Corey, tell us a little bit about you and what you're doing at Blizzard.
Sure, Chris. I run the broadcast technology group at Blizzard Entertainment. Our primary functions from a team standpoint, as it was incepted 2 years ago when I joined the company, was to build the next generation of television experience platform for Blizzard to deliver Overwatch League coming up this fall. We'll have, coming in the new year, Call of Duty League, BlizzCon, unifying a complete platform across all of our different endpoints, whether it's owned and operated platforms, partnerships with Twitch, and our syndication media rights partners like ESPN. So taking basically everything from a technology stack from the ground up, building basically a brand new end-to-end platform for our entertainment.
Good, good. So I hope today, and I'm not sure if a lot of you have read a lot of the materials that are in the space, but one of the themes that BuyDRM and the industry at large has been discussing more and more, is the more pervasive use of DRM throughout the entire creation to consumer workflow. So at IBC, we talked about that. We have some stuff about it on our blog, but as a general topic within our industry, using DRM to close more and more of the gaps between the studio, the post-studio, the distribution and coding house, the OVP platform, the CDN, the user's playback platform. At each stop along there, there's a gap that offers an opportunity for the content to leak or be devalued or be used inappropriately. I made some notes here because I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint, but let's go ahead and kick off talking about B2B use and fifth kind. Now, from what I had understood when we talked quite a bit about your use of DRM, some of the points that I perceive that your company and companies who operate screeners use DRM for, and this is just kind of setting the landscape of why a company would use DRM. Highly sensitive content, the stuff that fifth kind protects and delivers, has extremely high value. Companies like Marvel, NBC, they trust these types of platforms with their most valuable stuff because there's a lot that has to happen before it's released. Secondly, they have a limited number of titles and playback sessions, so they're not like a B2C consumer site. They've got much less number of touches, but the touches are 100 times more important than an end consumer that's playing a free video somewhere. So every time someone interacts with a piece of content in their system, A, it's a high value person, but B, the content is equally of incredibly high value, correct? Yep. I'll run through these just real quick. Leaking could prove to be a showstopper. If a title were to leak out of their system, it could severely damage their business, it could hurt the marketing and production of the movie. And lastly, DRM is not a standalone technology, and this is a recurring theme that I've written a lot about, and I think you'll probably see more and more. But in their case, Steve's company uses a whole arsenal, a whole spectrum of security technologies. Session management, stream tokens, user management, credential management, watermarking, stream session management, and DRM. And in some cases, visual watermarking, if I'm correct. So kind of taking all that into account, Steve, tell me kind of in your company, what was kind of the main driving force to make a move towards adopting DRM into your screener platform?
Yeah, I come from a pretty heavy engineering background, fell into the film industry. But what became apparent from day one was just the level of sensitivity around security. And I'm dealing with content 2.5 to 3 years before release. Yeah. And so the protection expectations are so high to keep everything protected throughout the whole life cycle of the production process to get to that actual final product. When you have 2,500 companies touching that production in some form, whether it be the actual film itself or content that you need to make the toy or to do other licensing, other partnerships, to onboard everybody, everyone has this expectation now of the consumer experience. And so we're trying to deliver that, the expectations around how well it streams, how secure it is, globally available, those type of consumer level experiences. We're trying to deliver that at the business level, give people the protection at all layers of the stack. So we have to go through the quarterly pen tests and the annual source code reviews. We are the tier 1 system for Disney. So, all the Star Wars posters and trailers, etc., they're all coming through us. So we're now responsible and have a huge amount of liability for anything that actually leaks. So the process of DRM is essential not only for my users' protection, for my clients' protection, but also for our own protection, because if content leaks, we also share responsibility there, unfortunately. So absolutely critical that it's seamless and secure.
And our company works with a variety of screener platforms, but I think a lot of what Steve just expressed is a very common viewpoint within the industry. More and more titles are becoming worth more, and the opportunity to lose them or for them to leak is also growing pretty dramatically. And so is the surface area of all of the different systems that a video would traverse through, let's say in the fifth kind platform, in terms of hardware, software, geography, personnel, operating system. So it definitely speaks to having that full spectrum of security, and DRM is probably the last tip of the spear, not the first tip of the spear in terms of what you're doing. Gulliver, kind of shifting over to B2C. Gulliver's platform, it's a consumer-oriented video platform, okay? So there's it's post-release content, but a massive amount of it. So where Steve has X number of titles, Gulliver has 100X number of titles and 1,000X number of plays. On top of that, in their platform, it's primarily Sony content, but there are also other content operators that operate within the platform. So not only does Gulliver and his team have an obligation to meet, the lawyers at Sony's requirements and the marketing and just the general management's needs, but also he's got to be able to, use the same level of business practice around security using DRM that all those other studios mandate themselves, both on their direct consumer platforms, D2C, and their B2C platforms. And then lastly, DRM prevents the most casual sharing of your content, and that people still have to log into the app to get the license to watch the content. Gulliver, it's kind of the same question back to you, is what was, in your business, what did you see, and you've been at this for a little while, so you could even talk about your time at BBC Worldwide if you wanted to, but what was the driving force at Sony to kind of push into the DRM space?
Right.
Maybe even talk about Xbox or what y'all were doing on there.
Yeah, so primarily, if we're just talking about Crackle as one of my products, the idea of Crackle is it's really a kind of curated service. So as with something like Spotify, like the service of putting the content together in the right order is actually what we're offering. Now, if you can get that content elsewhere, then that's not good, right? So we needed to secure that, but we were making ourselves available across the widest range of platforms. So I think at one point we had about 25 different devices that we were supporting. We've reduced that now over time as some of them are cycled out. So things like Toshiba TVs and things like that we don't support anymore. But we've still got about 15 different platforms to deal with, and really just making sure that all of those are secure. And not only to meet Sony's own requirements, but Sony can't place requirements on other studios if it's not meeting them itself, right? So we're our own kind of hardest customer, if you like, in that respect. So yeah, as you say, it took us a long time to get that right. We had all sorts of challenges on the different platforms trying to get interoperability between like kind of Adobe software and Microsoft and various other things like that we had some serious struggles with. And also, keeping that up to date every year, because you talk about 24 apps, but that could be up to 60 different code bases, right? Because you've got 3 versions of Samsung TV and 3 versions of LG TV and various older consoles and stuff like that. So you end up with the challenge is really keeping up to date. So anything that I think for us moves us in the direction of having 1 or 2 standards rather than a multiplicity of them is also something that we're really interested in.
Yeah. As a side note, when I first started working with Sony Crackle, they presented to us this incredibly unbelievable approach to playing back on the Xbox, which included using the Xbox as the playback platform, using the Adobe Media Player as the player, and using Microsoft's DRM as the DRM component. It was a pretty big challenge, but it's proven to be a very effective platform. And similarly, Corey, when we talk about esports, so what the event and the kind of the big thing that Corey works on is this annual Blizzcon event. It's a massive event. Corey's going to tell you how big it is. There's articles on the internet about it. It's probably one of the biggest produced events in the gaming sports business because of the size and scope of it. But it's gamer-oriented content at an annual confab that's streamed to every device and platform out there almost, right? It's a premium event. It's $50 for just basically 2 days of streaming. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it's a pretty substantial amount of money. The quality of the content is insane, very good. And the information that's contained in the video that Corey is distributing is really the sole focus of the event, because they're doing product announcements, they're doing roadmap announcements, they're having tournaments, they're getting high-level communications from different product managers. And then, lastly, DRM ensures that mostly only the people who actually paid that have logged into the site have access to it. So Corey, I'm kicking the same question over to you. Kind of what was the driving force at Blizzard to implement DRM for BlizzCon?
Sure. So I'll give people kind of a high-level view of BlizzCon. Imagine a takeover of the entire Anaheim Convention Center is where we do kind of our Burning Man meets video game play. In our world, every day is World of Warcraft. So the event we put on has to be just as massive as that world happens to be. So when we go about like building the event and installing our production there, this last year we had 7 production pits at the backside of the convention center. We had 7 live stages, almost basically concurrently running throughout the course of the 2 days. So we kick up at 9:30 a.m., we go till 10 o'clock at night. 2 days in a row. The emphasis for a lot of the stuff that we did for the DRM service 2 years ago was for BlizzCon to protect content behind our paywall, our virtual ticket product. Because in previous years, we were using tokenization at like a CDN edge network to kind of protect against, theft of content or replay of the M3 U8s across other different sites. And we kind of looked at that and said, that's just kind of silly for us to do. Let's go ahead and own as much of this pipeline as possible. And the DRM piece was a natural fit to bring in-house. So what we set out to do was essentially that is when we built this platform over the last couple of years, DRM was a critical component and piece because we needed to protect our content for one, but we wanted to take more control and ownership. So from a CDN perspective, and there's another panel I'll be on later, it kind of describes more of like our scalability in the cloud and how we do distribution. But when I have over multiple millions of hits of video content throughout the course of the weekend, I need to make sure that the content's protected in a way where not only can you get the content to play back in a reasonable manner, all of our videos shipped at 1080p 60 at 10 megabits. So our high bit rate is very high for most standards. But we needed to have basically an infrastructure that allowed us to kind of control the entirety of the content ecosystem from the time that it was encoded to the time it was shipped, the time that it was packaged and placed on origin, both for live and for VOD. The DRM was really the only way to go because we obviously want to diversify our edge delivery, our distribution. To tie things into our ecosystem that are out of our control is not a good business sense in our world. So,
Corey, real quick, could you just tell the audience how big BlizzCon was in terms of like cameras, venues, streams, like some of the rough metrics?
Let's see if I'm trying to think of what I can share. I would say that over the course of the opening keynote, across all of our distribution platforms, we had well over 2.5 million concurrent watching the show.
And so, how many venues or how many buildings did you have different production stages going on?
We had one production stage. Really for the opening ceremony, it's really more 3 stages that kind of tie each other into one another from a product announcement standpoint. So as the show kicks off, opening ceremonies on one stage, they pass it along to another stage, and so the production actually switches from a master control perspective right there at the venue. If you haven't been to BlizzCon, what I would say is that what you would think of as a traditional master control environment and how the show is traditionally sent back to somewhere like New York to be switched out in a control room, we actually build master control on site at the floor of the convention center. So everybody that walks into the venue who's attending the show can actually see the live production work, both from a truck perspective, the actual stagecraft that's going on, and then actually master production. So going back to the concurrency piece, across all of the different tuners, it's an incredible amount of scale and it's an incredible amount of outlets that has your content. And who's to say, DRM is just one piece of the puzzle where somebody could actually be watching it on their PC, but they could still be OBSing and exploiting the content off to Twitch or to Facebook or YouTube. It's not 100% silver bullet to protecting your content. It will, though, in our case, allow us to control where the eyeballs see the ultimate experience. So ultimately, we want people to be on our own platforms, but we know people hijack our content and we go do takedowns in those respects. But it's kind of the first phase of a multi-phase approach for securing our content, which the next piece would be like forensic watermarking.
Yes, and there's a lot of movement towards that. Okay, so we're into the kind of second round of questions, which we want to talk about. What were some of the hurdles around getting DRM in place in your platform? I have pretty innate knowledge of what those hurdles were, but Steve, without digging up too many bad emotions, could you maybe describe what people in the room should expect when they want to implement Fairplay with Apple, for example, and kind of how much they need to really focus?
Yeah, you got to plan ahead for that one. Just it does take time. So Apple have a unique process in getting their certificate in that you can't, we can't get one as the content owner. So Disney, we have to go through a process for them to get a certificate, and then Universal for them to get a certificate. So every time we ramp up a client, basically there's this additional layer that we have to go through of Apple to getting this certification for Fairplay per client. So it is a little bit frustrating. We understand it for security reasons why it's done, but yeah, that's one of our hurdles.
So Steve makes a good point. We've written about this at thedrmblog.com, by the way. It's a great resource. I'm the publisher of the site. There's a lot of vendor agnostic information there, but one of the things that Steve makes a good point about is that Fairplay is pretty much the dominant DRM and screener platforms, I would say, because of the studio's ties to iOS and Apple TV and so on. Apple is not really designed Fairplay to be a ride-along technology so that everyone in the room can use it to make money. It's mostly a technology designed to get you to make your platform and playback compatible with what Apple's doing, so that Apple can kind of live next to you, and they've been evolving the program. Originally, when the program came out, every organization that wanted to do Fairplay just got one master Fairplay certificate. The only problem with that is, as you can imagine, if Marvel has a Fairplay certificate for their own streaming of Fairplay, of HLS with Fairplay, but then they give that certificate to Steve's company, then now the chain of custody of the certificate has been broken, and so Marvel themselves can't really rely that that certificate is safe. So what Apple has done, with the recommendation of our company and many others in the media space, is they now offer a master certificate for the parent company, and then for each different property that you're distributing content, or vendor, like an OTT platform or a screener platform, you have to get a different Fairplay certificate for each one of those platforms. It does take a little longer. Apple's process is a little more complex, but I think the value is pretty good considering the market. Gulliver, I kind of took away part of your challenges when we talked about the Adobe Media Player, but maybe what we could do is you could speak a little bit about what's going on right now with Venu and kind of the rebuilding of the platform and how you're approaching it with DRM there, yeah.
Sure, so, well, actually you touched on a piece there with the Apple certification, right, because we're going to bump into that. So as we take the platform that we've built at Sony and we're now productizing and white labeling it, bringing on new clients onto that platform, we're going to be running multiple products on a platform. We're going to have the same certification type problems.
Sure.
So a lot of our challenges are really around the sheer scale of the number of apps that we have to support. And then also, like, real dumb stuff, like you can't show a sprint demo that the DRM's working because the DRM's working, so it gets blocked by Google Hangouts and things like that. Right?
Yeah.
So just knowing that everything's up and running at any one time is a real challenge. And then obviously, as each platform changes each year, brings out new standards, et cetera. I mean, we would love if Apple would adopt CMAF, right? So we could get the number of video production chains that we have to run internally down to as close to one as possible, basically. So those are the kinds of things that we struggle with daily, really. But obviously, we need to protect the content. We need to be able to provide that to our customers. It's part of what we're offering. We're offering a studio-grade solution. It needs studio-grade security, and that's what we have. So keeping to the plate spinning of keeping that up to date is really the
it's no small lift. Corey. Without naming the actual company, could you talk a little bit about last year's Blizzcon and how companies like you are pushing the edge on evolving the performance of DRMs?
Sure. So I was digging through my phone to find some statistics of this year's BlizzCon, and I found it interesting regarding the iOS conversation, because a lot of our customers are not on iOS, and we actually could tell this trend based on the licensing handout.
Right.
So DRM total license keys issued are over 7 million during the course of 2 days of BlizzCon, where 6.5 million of that is actually Widevine. and only 613,000 of that is actually iOS devices. Wow. So that really tells us where our audience is actually at and what platforms we should actually be gravitating towards in terms of tailoring or improving those experiences. I'm not exactly sure why there's so many less Apple users out there watching our content, but we could tell that story with the licensing handout. Going back to the original kind of question from last year to this year, the DRM has made vast improvements, but those improvements come with hiccups in the road. So as Google does their thing and they put out new SDKs for their licensing scenarios, we then have to go back and kind of regression test a lot of those things, and it takes time to kind of tease those things out. So we had an issue kind of going into this year's BlizzCon from last year, thinking everything was all right, but then there was an SDK update on the Widevine side that kind of threw things into a little bit of a firefight because of some new security parameters they put into the streaming, and we were wondering if our backwards compatible. Our backwards compat was actually still going to actually work from last year's content that we actually had DRM. So imagine a content library that continues to grow year after year after year, and as the software changes both on the Widevine and Fairplay and even PlayReady, and there was like 100,000 PlayReady licenses that we served out. So that kind of tells you where that platform is at. But as these things evolve, the back compat for us is incredibly important because we don't have the opportunity to go back and re-encode that entire library because it's either been captured live or it was cut in some post house somewhere and delivered back to us where we no longer have the masters. So it's incredibly important for us to, from a performance perspective, really lock these things where it's an ecosystem that is evolving and not necessarily a rip out and replace every single year. So I hope that answers some of the question.
I mean, just to speak to the part that Corey brought up, not to say anything negative about Google or Widevine, but really what companies like Corey are doing is they're helping improve products like Widevine and Fairplay across the board by taking them to a very extreme level of usage, which kind of draws out from time to time things that haven't been thought about. But then Google comes back in and improves the SDKs as a result, and that benefits everybody in the room and everyone in the business that's doing these massive events where you've got hundreds of requests a second coming in at the very beginning of the event. So in a weird way, when Corey and Blizzard break a DRM, it's actually a good thing because they didn't break it from a security standpoint, they broke it from a performance standpoint.
That's correct.
And so being able to improve the performance of it, it benefits everybody.
Just to kind of highlight
real
quick, little story, little anecdote from last year's BlizzCon. So Friday, it's a Friday-Saturday event. So Friday kicks off, everything's fine. We're there hanging out. I see some people laughing because they know what's coming up. So Saturday morning shows up. There were some things that happened in our ecosystem that we were trying to firefight throughout the evening. So a lot of us were kind of stuck at the convention center for the last 20 some odd hours at that point. So we get ready to kind of bring everything up and go live for the Saturday show, and all of a sudden reports start just pouring in like we can't get video to play, can't get video to play. So we start looking into it, and it turns out that we basically, based on some kind of load algorithmic thing that happened, we ended up killing basically the license handout service in the back end and completely brought it to its knees. What do? You're an hour before your show starts and your encoders are frying up. Do you rip the DRM off your encoders? Because there is no restarting of them in the middle of the event. You're either live or you're not. So we had to make the decision to kind of figure out how to fix the problem with the service or rip it out entirely. The opportunity for us to rip it out wasn't really an option, but it was a decision that we had to make within several minutes. And so I'm actually frantically on the phone and walking back and forth between master control and web operations room to try to figure out what the problem was. And it was pretty stressful. But these are the things that, when you're doing things that are unique, that nobody's ever done before in terms of high concurrency spikes and things like that, you find problems in production much faster than you would anywhere else. And so there's nothing like production load. There's nothing like stressing to failure. And so, not to belabor the point, but you have to build to scale. And we've identified a problem in the back end, and unfortunately it didn't rear its ugly head until day 2. But there was about an hour there before the show started on Saturday that that there was a lot of
phone calls.
There was a lot of yelling and screaming and trying to figure out what was going on. So, if you want more detail on that, feel free to.
We all thank you for finding that, and
hope,
and that we were able to identify it and fix it.
I heard there was a finder's fee, but I haven't gotten the check yet.
Dinner, maybe a dinner somewhere. Okay, so we're in the last phase of questions, and we've got about 10 minutes. we're gonna speak for about 3 more minutes, and but before I wrap it up, is anyone in the room gonna be interested in asking a question? Could you just raise your hand if you have a question so I can figure out how much time we're gonna need? Not really. Okay, well, you're learning. Questions aren't always necessary. So this last part, I just want to talk about kind of what are your future needs from DRM, and what do you see as being what's going to help you use DRM in the future? And I think, Gulliver, I'm going to start out with you because you mentioned something earlier, and maybe you could turn Gulliver's mic up just a little bit. If you could just real quick speak to this whole thing around the effects of DRM and CMAF and kind of, what you need to be able to make CMAF work because of the DRM issue?
Well, effectively, we are having to package multiple single bits of content in multiple ways, multiple times, right? And that problem only gets worse as you try to do live, as you try to do library, as you try to do fast turnaround, et cetera, right? And some of the stuff for automation, we're turning things around in 20 minutes. Some of the things for Crackle, they've been in the can for years. But again, having to have multiple copies is just inefficient, it's expensive, and it chews up team time, chews up testing time. So I think if we can move towards a single standard, if Apple would adopt CMAF, then we could kind of head in that direction. I think things have been good in the last few years. It's definitely gotten a lot easier from the Wild West of before. Because especially we're dealing with a lot of connected TVs as well, and Rokus and other devices. It's not, I know you guys talk about Android and iOS, and we do a lot of that as well, but most of my world, like 85% of my world is connected TVs and big screens. So just trying to normalize across that, normalize the flow of content into that, the kind of workflows of producing content and not having multiple endpoints, multiple places that can go wrong, multiple license servers, et cetera, would be a major boost.
So I assume some of you in the room, or most of you are, Petter has a question. Hold on one second. I assume most of you are aware that the industry is trying to move to a common media application framework, CMAF, which would be like the holy grail file formats. My personal viewpoint, not a big fan, just like CPICs and common encryption. But by doing so, what Gulliver explains is that at the point where Apple supports CMAF, or we have one encryption format, whether it's CBCS or CTR or what it ends up being, DRM is kind of heavily weighting that arrival point because we're close. So we had Dash, but now we're kind of setting Dash aside, and HLS say, well, let's just stuff them into one container. It has implications around the DRM component, mostly on the playback side. And so that's something that, as an industry, we're all going to be working on together to solve. And with that, Petter, you had a question?
Yeah, that's a good idea. And a question for Gulliver. You brought up the issue of large screen TVs and smart TVs.
Yeah.
In my mind, it has been a challenge for years to actually secure those platforms. Has that improved?
Let me repeat his question. So the question was, Petter asked Gulliver, is with all these large screen smart TVs out there and movement toward 4K, and Petter has a lot of experience in this, so I know it's a loaded question, but how do you see the security around that improving? Are the TVs getting more secure? Or, are you hearing from vendors that they're supporting your needs and what you need?
Yeah, yeah, we are obviously in regular touch with these vendors, right? What I'm actually seeing more is that the consumer market is consolidating. So we're switching off elements of the long tail over time, right? Certainly in the US, like Roku's in 1 in 3 TVs being sold now, right? Amazon seems to have a third of the market. Apple TV's probably got 15 to 17% of the market. So as those dominant players emerge, then people are using their PlayStations less for streaming video, right? They're more of a games platform. See the same on Xbox. So I think the conversations become more concentrated into one place, right? Rather than having to have a major round of vendor conversations at every CES, our world is kind of shrinking a bit, and we're focusing on the scale platform. So that's basically how that is evolving. And those guys are obviously all 4K ready, taking that stuff pretty seriously. So it's kind of getting easier from that perspective, but less easy in another way, because obviously when the people are big enough, they can do what Apple do and just say, well, here it is, and if you don't like it,
And I think also we've got just a couple minutes left, but I think also, Petter, one of the things that's really driving smart TVs is also the fact that kind of Android TV is now like overnight taken over the entire smart TV business. Ardetto, Nagra, Via Access, all deeply committed to those platforms and kind of shifting the way they're doing business. But because of that, these TVs then have trusted computing or enclaves in them where keys can be securely stored by hardware, which then enable the playback of 4K content securely. And so like on Android TVs now, all the new ones coming out, you can get level 1 widevine, for example, which is a hardware version of software widevine, where the keys are stored in a managed black box. Only the application through a secure pipeline can get to the keys. That's what's driving when you see 4K in your TV. It's not so much the content owners. We see this a lot with a lot of our partners, Epics and others, is there still aren't hardware DRM, but as we move towards Android TV, which I personally believe is going to completely replace the entire smart TV market, it'll be much more secure. And then with widevine CAS and some of the stuff that the conditional access companies are doing, I think smart TVs are getting to the point where they're almost ultimately secure. And I know there's other companies in the business that are rolling out solutions for this type of IoT security, if you will. Steve, lastly, so in your world with what y'all are doing with your screener platform, if you could talk to Apple right now on this camera right here, what feedback would you get them outside the licensing program? Are there other features or things you'd like to be able to do with Fairplay, or?
Good question.
Or DRM in general. It doesn't have to be Fairplay either.
Yeah, I think the broader DRM challenge just to start, is tied in the general security challenge, right? It's always a moving target. Compute's just going to keep increasing. Our strategies around encryption are going to keep changing. The browsers keep changing. The players have to adapting. So it is a constantly evolving space. And as a platform, and I'm sure all these platforms, we all need to keep up with that to support our users. As far as continually to bring more security, to the space, being able to introduce, potentially a forensic component would be amazing. We have to do a lot of work right now on the forensic side. The visual watermarking is one strategy. The forensic is quite different. A lot more upfront compute on the forensic side versus, the visual watermarking. So things like that, where they could bring additional functionality, additional features, could be very interesting.
Sure.
Just to kind of round out the security streaming components and not have to kind of cobble together multiple solutions.
Sure. I think to that extent, I've written articles about this on streaming media. There's a lot of information about it, but I think the entire media business moving to forensically watermarked, just-in-time packaged content with DRM on it. That seems to be kind of where we're headed. But it's an interesting point you bring up. It would be interesting to see if the DRM OEMs could work with the Civolutions and Verimatrix and Content Armors of the world to even find a deeper, maybe integration or security component of that. So that's very helpful. Another question, please. I mean, I would take that one. I feel like I might be a subject matter expert in that, at least I hope so. Well, there's been some things that have kind of, frankly, we've written about this too on our blog and talked about it. I mean, as an industry voice, I'm a little concerned about like common encryption and CPICs because they seem to introduce issues in the entire ecosystem. For example, with common encryption, if one DRM gets hacked, then the other DRM is in essence hacked because the content key is the same. That's one very big concern. A lot of concerns around CPICs, decreasing the velocity and security of encryption keys, getting fed into like AWS, Elemental, and cloud encoding. But on the DRM performance side, this is something that I'll just speak for my company's behalf because I can't speak for any of the other DRM companies' behalf, but I would just say that we have spent a lot of time creating highly available DRM solutions that can handle, the largest traffic on the internet in terms of throughput of license keys. The issue you have, though, is that when you talk about parity between a Fairplay or a Widevine or a PlayReady, is they're all designed completely differently. And the groups that design them have designed them for different reasons that have nothing to do with your business. They were designed for Apple, Google, and Microsoft to advance their platforms. And also the rights objects from DRM to DRM don't match. So, each DRM, like for example, I would say PlayReady has the largest set of rights, while Fairplay maybe has the least, and Widevine's in the middle. Those are more of the limiting issues around the through, and also because of the way you create the licenses, you can create a Widevine license faster than you can make a PlayReady license. You can make a Fairplay license probably in the middle of the two. So there is a little bit of average rounding there when you talk about how much throughput you can really put through. But I think a lot of companies are starting to address this. I mean, moving to Linux on Docker containers or moving to other computing systems or improving the performance of it, where you might have been running a Windows platform for the actual license creation component of your platform. But I think you'll see a lot of changes in that, and I think hopefully you know who to speak to about that.
I mean, to add to that, I would see the complexity around getting DRM working in terms of agility and ability to innovate is more of a barrier to entry. I think once you've got it working, you're good. And it typically doesn't break once you've got it working, right? But I think getting there, if you have a team and you want to build 10 apps and you want to get out to market, it's going to take up a lot of your time initially as you get out there, right? So just getting yourself organized internally so you can test it, organized internally so you can deploy it. But once it's up and running, feature updates, things like that, it's not too big a break on innovation that we found anyway. So.
It's not exactly like a silver bullet though. Once it's running,
no. Well, if you're scaling like you guys are, it's slightly different.
Our mileage.
Yeah, I mean we have millions of users, but they're very distributed. We don't have the peaks like you guys have.
Right. So like from our standpoint, like we have to go every time we make a change to our platform, we have to go recertify every single browser that could be a permutation on a mobile device, a PC, iPad. We have, the gaming community itself is pretty savvy, and so they're very unforgiving as well when things are, seem to be rebuffering or there's lack of performance. They'll actually start picking apart our streams and trying to figure out like what our bit rates are and things like that. It's very, it's not like the OTT where you're watching it in the living room and you're not interrogating a Netflix app on your smart TV the same way you would be on your PC. So for us, anytime that there's a glitch in performance, it definitely spells problems for us in terms of building that quality experience. And so we really look for things in the industry to get common, right? So every single time there's a browser update, something breaks. Every time there's an OS update, something breaks. We have to support MPEG Dash and HLS because of the two variant types of device markets out there. So we're really hoping that the industry itself can get together and kind of like do away with the old school legacy of licensing rights on codecs and encoding methodologies and kind of get more on the same page with one another in terms of building standardized frameworks for encoding and delivering video, because everybody wants to make money on the content. The content is, the money is not going to be made on the licensing rights for the codec, in my opinion anyways.
Last thing I'll just add is I think there's a trend in our business because CDNs can't cache DRM licenses and CDNs don't operate DRM networks, that there's a trend to build regional nodes in clouds like GCP, AWS, and Azure that are DRM-specific networks for large-scale deployments. So, it's become a kind of more common trend if you have a client that has a very high, RPS, requests per second, and they have a huge, massive audience. The really only best way to solve it is you've got to throw a lot of, redundant resources at it, but it's got to be dedicated and in the region where most of your traffic is. You can't just rely on a CDN or a standard hosting company. So, all All right, well, we've run over a few minutes. I see Jose and Eric in the back room with the noose, so I'm going to call it. But thank you again, everybody, for attending today. We really appreciate it, and thank you to our panelists, and thank you to ITI. Thank you so much.